Welcome back to Photo History and our Week 3 lecture on landscape photography in the 19th century. Today we're going to consider how it was used and some of the potential motivations for landscape photography in the 19th century. To recap last week's video, if you recall, in our study of portraiture, the daguerreotype was viewed as an accurate recording. The book characterizes it as a device they believed would faithfully record actuality, whereas the calotype was seen as more artistic, they had more aesthetic control, and it was capable of having emotion projected or embedded into it. We can think of the daguerreotype's reputation during this time as being a fruit of the Industrial Revolution, because it's considered an accurate recorder of truth and actuality. It's seen as very scientifically precise. You can definitely connect it to the view of human reason and the scientific method that came out of the Enlightenment, which eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. Whereas when we consider the calotype and the movement of art photographers that started to coalesce around it, that art photography impulse can be seen as a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. Next, we considered our sliding scale as a way to understand whether or not something is an art object, and if it is, it helps us start to understand how it exists as an art object. Does it skew more to the craft side of things, and the materials are much more important than any message or concept or idea that it might embody? Or does it skew in the other direction, where it's much more about ideas and a concept? So maybe it's closer to philosophy or propaganda. But art tends to live between these two extremes, where we have a mixture of concept and ideas and message, along with materials, possibly some function. Upon examining something as an art object and trying to come to a conclusion about whether or not it is art, or is it possibly something else like craft or propaganda, the next step is to critique that work of art. If you recall, the definition that we've been using for criticism in this context is informed discourse about art to increase understanding and appreciation of art. The kind of shorthand one that I like is Harry Braude's view of it as enlightened cherishing. The first step of this is description. What am I looking at? What can I say for certain about what's in the photo? This is where we gather our information, so that when we discourse about something, when we talk about it and have a conversation about whether it's art, and if so, how good is it? What does it mean? Before we can really do that meaningfully, we have to understand what it is we're seeing. We have to describe it and examine it. Interpretation. We need to make sense of it. We need to understand, what does it mean? What does it represent? What is it expressing? What is it about? What kind of formal features does it exhibit? And what things embedded in the photograph signify things that aren't immediately apparent, that aren't on the surface of the photo. So many photos, some of my favorites, tend to be ones that you have to sit with for a while. You have to look and examine and think, and they might function almost as poetry or metaphor, as opposed to something that's very literal and the meaning jumps out at you right away. Next, we considered what makes an interpretation a strong one. We talked about how it won't have the same type of ironclad certainty that you can have from certain kinds of philosophical arguments, or from perhaps scientific experiments or math, but we can build an interpretation that is strong, or that is very highly plausible. To do this, we need good evidence that we find in the photo, and then there can be other evidence such as biographical information, information about the process that was used to make the photograph, reviews, things like that. But we need evidence that can back our claims when we try to assert that the photograph means a particular thing. We need to be able to have evidence that backs that up and that makes our conclusion strong, that makes it logical, that makes it plausible. And finally, after we've described it, we've gathered all this information, we've taken some time to make a strong interpretation of the work, what we think that it means, then we can move to evaluating it. And we simply ask, is it good? Did it accomplish what it was trying to do? Did it communicate? Did it express? Did it represent what it claimed that it was? Next, let's move on to landscape photography in the 19th century, and let's consider some of the ways that it was used. Today we're going to be looking at expedition photography, science, so this was used by botanists, geologists, many others. We'll look at its use as a souvenir for travelers. We'll consider some of its uses in art, and then we'll look at the very end of our lecture, we'll look at some of the motivations for these different uses. To begin with, let's consider expedition photography. This is an example by an unknown photographer of the Taj Mahal in India. As we've noted before, many economies in the Western world of America, France, the UK, and others, many of their economies were growing because of their head start in pioneering the Industrial Revolution. These growing economies needed resources to feed that growth, and they needed territory to feed their imperial ambitions. So all of these powers were trying to outmaneuver and demonstrate their superiority to their other rival colonial powers. So you recall from your textbook that when the daguerreotype was invented and the French government bought the rights to it, they would allow anyone in the world except England to make daguerreotypes. You could make daguerreotypes in England, but you had to pay for a license for it. So that's a little example of the rivalry of some of these. But all of these powers were vying for control of sea lanes, markets around the world, and this fueled colonialism. These expeditions would survey areas that were seen as potential colonies, and if not a colony, then a new market to trade with. And many of those countries, trade relations had to be forced because they were not open to the rest of the world. But these colonial powers came and forced trade relations with them. These surveys would also look for minerals that could be exploited, so gold, silver, precious metals. Cameras came along for the ride in all of this to record, document, and to be used as propaganda as well. Photographs would be sent back and be used to justify the expeditions and say, look at our great nation, what we're accomplishing around the world. They would also use it to kind of pat themselves on the back and say, see, look how advanced we are. We're different from these primitive people in these areas that they were colonizing. Survey and expedition photos would also be used to help fund future expeditions. There's an example by Felice Beato from Japan. Right away you can see that these are incredibly sharp and detailed. This is from capture of the Taku forts. As I mentioned before, Japan was one of those nations that was not open to the outside world and did not want trade relations with Western countries, but were forced by these colonial powers. Here's an example from China, another country with whom trade relations were forced. This one from India being a British colony at the time. In the book, Rosenblum says about India that photography there was considered a documentary tool with which to describe to the mother country the exotic and mysterious landscape, customs, and people of a subject land. It's another example from India. You can see how these images would have been enticing and mysterious to people of the time seeing them for the first time. Many of the scenes they may have heard about or encountered in books of mythology, legends, history, the Bible, unless they were very wealthy, could not have afforded to travel to those places. This is Francis Bedford, The Ruins of Damascus in Syria. This is by John Beasley Green, who, although he died at the young age of 24, was able to go along on an expedition to Egypt and bring back some very stunning photos. And while these expedition photographs were used as part of the machinery of colonialism and these darker purposes of the colonial expeditions were present in photography from a very early time in America, they were also instrumental in helping put some of these raw, untouched, wild lands into the awareness of the general public. These photographs were used to argue for the creation of the very first national parks. Here's an example by Timothy O'Sullivan, another example of O'Sullivan's landscapes. Often military expeditions work together with scientists and scientific aims. If you recall from our last lecture, Oscar Raylander, one of the forerunners of pictorialism and an early pioneer of art photography, later went on to collaborate with Charles Darwin on one of his books. The British photographer Anna Atkins used photography to record plant life. These are from her book Photographs of British Algae, which is one of the very first photo books. As you can see, she was using the cyanotype process. Here's some work by the French photographer Adolphe Braun. These expeditions, whether scientific or survey expeditions, provided material for botanists and geologists and other scientists to study. In Darwin's first expedition, the famous one on board the Beagle, the HMS Beagle, artists were on that expedition, but you can imagine their excitement if they had had access to a camera to help them document some of the things they had seen, rather than having to rely on the skill of the artists who attended the expedition. Here's a great quote I thought warranted including: "Photographic evidence was considered synonymous with truth and the image as a substitute for first-hand experience." So as a tool of science, this is just, an improvement in their arsenal of tools, rather than the artist having this recorder of scientific accuracy with them. The photograph would help their efforts. Next, let's consider photography as travel souvenir. It comes from a Latin word that literally meant to come up, later evolved to the French definition, to remember, and today in English we consider it something kept as a remembrance, and we usually think of that as being from a place we visited. It could be a set of Mickey Mouse ears from Disneyland, or it could be a photograph of yourself at the pyramids in Egypt. Because of these growing economies that we've mentioned and a growing middle class, it meant that many more people who wanted to were able to travel. When you think of the earlier days of agrarian economies, only the very wealthiest could afford to travel. If you were a farmer, how could you have afforded the time and the money to leave your farm, pay others to do the jobs that you would have done, and then go to another place? It simply wasn't an option for most people. Travel would have been much more localized. But by the time of the Industrial Revolution, and you have a growing middle class, and there's more and more disposable income, they were able to begin traveling. And as images came back from survey expeditions, it just fed that appetite to want to travel and go visit these places. One way that people would have encountered some of these views of these exotic places was with stereoscopic viewers. The book mentioned it in last week's reading, but this was a cheap way for people to consume photography. These were very, very popular, and you can see the machine used to view these photographs was fairly simple. Here's another viewer, even simpler one. This is one that could be held in your hands instead of a tabletop like this one. And some of you may be old enough to have experienced one of these in your childhood. These viewers and the stereo photographs that were produced for them were so popular that this made it possible to have a landscape photography business. These businesses would cater to travelers who couldn't photograph. Maybe they didn't have the means. It was still fairly complicated and technical at this point. Or maybe like the frustrations that Talbot had on his honeymoon when he was trying to use a camera Lucida and trace out drawings of the places that he visited on his honeymoon. Maybe they were similarly frustrated, and these were ways to remember and bring back souvenirs of their travels. Here's an example of a stereoscopic photograph from Palestine. Here's a stereoscopic photograph from Egypt. Probably can't quite make out the caption, but it says it's the entrance to the Great Pyramid. But for this growing middle class, being well-traveled would have been seen as a sign of being well-rounded, educated, cosmopolitan. And as I mentioned, this would signify to other people that you weren't somebody who was of the working class that had to spend all your days in difficult physical labor. Another example of a stereoscopic photograph. And one from Italy. As photography progressed and technology was improved and it became easier and easier to photograph, more and more people were making their own photographs. And eventually landscape photography was much more difficult to make a living at. To this day, a simple Google search of amateur travel photography will bring up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tutorials, tips, and now we would say that anyone can be a photographer. Anyone with a cell phone, anyone with a DSLR is a photographer and can make great images. Interestingly, that idea is not a new one. There was a point at which, by the late 1800s, much landscape photography was simply viewed as souvenirs and bits to be collaged into a scrapbook. I think many understand that while advances in camera technology have made photography much easier, not everyone can do it. It still takes a trained eye to know how to frame a photograph in a pleasing way. There's so much about exposure, framing, composition, and having a good sense for people and observational skills that not everyone has and not every photograph possesses. Next, as we consider art photography, we've discussed the ways that the art of the time reflected a trend towards romanticism with an emphasis on emotion and light and atmosphere. Think of the paintings of Turner that we looked at earlier. But the art of the day can be seen as a visualization of those romantic ideals. This is an example by the painter Frederick Church, part of the so-called Hudson River School of Painting. The Hudson River painters were from the East Coast, but many of them traveled west and painted scenes that the expedition photographers were recording as well. This is a painting of Niagara Falls. If you've ever been there, you know that there's a lot of development around it now on both the US and Canadian sides. There's another example of one of Frederick Church's paintings, and one by Albert Bierstadt called Among the Sierras. If you've ever hiked or backpacked in the Sierras here in California, you know how stunning some of the views can be. And this painting, I think, does a great job of capturing just how awesome those views can be. Here's work by the photographer Carlton Watkins of the Yosemite Valley. Even in his day, Watkins was, his work was already seen as being kind of a symbol of what Rosenblum calls that transcendent idealism. Watkins also made stereographic photographs, so I'll show you. If you ever actually get to view one, they won't vibrate quite the way these do, but this animation will cycle between the two views so you get a sense of the movement in the scene. And here's another. You can see that although these were photographs made for a survey, Watkins has a great sense of composition and framing. you can see Watkins trying to give a sense of the scale and the majesty of these places. Here's an example of a contemporary daguerreotype by the Vietnamese-American photographer Binh Danh. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, unfortunately, so please forgive my language skills. These were made about 10 years ago, and he traveled to many of the places Carleton Watkins and some of the other pioneers of landscape photography in America, to many of the places they went and rephotographed them with the daguerreotype process. Definitely recommend looking up more of his work, and we have more examples from Timothy O'Sullivan. If any of you have ever spent time on the East Coast or in the Midwest, you know that the scenery and the landscapes there in the Midwest, it's very flat, and on the East Coast, the mountains are not as tall and not quite as imposing as what we have here in the West. When I lived in Rochester, New York, when locals found out that I backpacked, they would recommend that I visit the Adirondack Mountains, which unfortunately I was never able to do. One local who had spent some time in California and had backpacked in the Sierras told me very straightforwardly, he said, the Adirondacks are beautiful, but you've been spoiled by the Sierras. They won't be anything like it. So as you consider O'Sullivan and Watkins images, you can imagine these are the kinds of things that those viewers would not have had direct access to, short of accompanying one of these excursions. Let's go back. And again, O'Sullivan as well has a great eye for framing and composition. It's one of his famous photographs of the Southwest, possibly his most famous. So now let's briefly consider some of the motivations for the different applications of landscape photography in the 19th century. When we think about science and expeditionary photography, we know that besides the potential economic interests that the colonial powers had, I think you can also see they both share a sense of curiosity and wonder at what they were seeing. Science and the expeditionary photography, they applied this new knowledge for different and sometimes conflicting ends. So think of mining and forestry versus the creation of national parks. But they both shared a wonder at the sights that they were seeing. Again, this stereoscopic photograph from Carleton Watkins, I think, is a great example of trying to capture that sense of wonder. As well, souvenir photography, besides the obvious examples that we've considered of symbols of class, status, and almost a one-upsmanship with your neighbor, showing them the latest place that you visited. Again, I think there's also this wonder and excitement and curiosity. Any of us who have traveled today can relate to that feeling of wanting to share an amazing sight that you witnessed on a trip. For art photographers, I think they're attempting to contain or bottle up or communicate, to share an experience of the sublime or the transcendent. So we consider what do we mean by the sublime? We mean something that's lofty, grand, or exalted in thought, expression, or manner. These are textbook definitions. It can also mean something of outstanding spiritual, intellectual, or moral worth. Transcendent means something that's extending or lying beyond the limits of ordinary experience. And as we've mentioned a few times already, just simply something that invokes a sense of awe. Awesome is probably one of the most overused words today that almost means nothing. But if you've ever been to places like, think of Yosemite or the Sierras, that's probably the best word to describe what those views do to you, what they make you feel like. It's rare for someone to see those and come away without a sense of awe. So often when simply scrolling through Instagram, when landscape photos appear in your feed, you can see a similar motivation. People are trying to, in some way, encapsulate or communicate something of the essence of that experience that they had in the landscape and share it with others. I think this contrasts with another motivation that is usually unconscious for most photographers. Bear with me for a moment. This might not be something you've considered, and I don't want to be morbid, but when you think about what a photograph does, a photograph is an attempt to grasp a single moment out of an unrelenting, ever-moving, almost liquid flow of time and hold on to them. We're trying to slow time and postpone death. We're trying to reach for immortality and that sense, that desire to not be forgotten. This has been noted by other photo theorists, including Roland Barthes in his book Camera Lucida. If you ever have a chance to read some of his essays, they're not written in necessarily the most accessible way, but he has some great insights there. But if you think about photos, especially of trips and journeys and personal moments, I think they're this unconscious way of trying to grab a moment out of that flow of time and hang on to it, because we understand that time doesn't stop, and we know that it moves in one direction. Landscape photography can still sort of function this way, but I think when we see it without people in the scenes, it can also be a way of unconsciously averting our eyes from death and the fear that goes along with that fear of not being remembered, that fear of not existing. The landscape photography can kind of be a way of turning our eyes away from that and turning it towards something that's bigger than ourselves, turning it towards something that's transcendent, something that's sublime, this beauty that invokes a sense of awe in us. And I think it's one reason why when we look at the work of, let's say, Timothy O'Sullivan, even though this was made for expeditionary purposes, military and government and science and all the rest that was wrapped into that colonial expansion, even though it was made for those purposes, he couldn't escape that artistic sensibility that still comes through in these images that try to translate an experience into an image that someone else can experience who wasn't present. So that wraps up our week 3 lecture. The textbook has a lot of great detail and more examples. I wanted to bring out some that weren't in the book, and spend a little bit more time just briefly thinking about how and why landscape photography was used the way it was in the 19th century, and get that in the back of our minds so that as we encounter landscape photography again through the rest of the course, we'll be able to have a better understanding of how each generation of photographers attempted to wrestle with the question of what to do with these landscapes and what they could say or mean or feel in a photograph.